The writers of the show are incredible. And they've taken this world from a video game and made it feel completely alive and believable. They've written a great narrative for which is the natural conflict is that between like Piltover and Zahn. Truly, it's been amazing to see. But there is one thing that they've done so wonderfully, and that is how they've handled all the characters. One thing that I've talked on my first video about Acts 1 and 2 was about how I fear that these characters would eventually become static if they were to reach the point in which they're in the video game, right? Because they're in the video game, they're like avatars for the player. They're like caricatures. And so my worry is that when you reach that point with their character arc, because they're avatars for the players, you don't want to change them too much, or you definitely don't want to kill them, for example. So one thing that might be levied against the characters which are champions in the game are that they have plot armor, and there's some stuff to talk about there, and I'll get into it towards the end of the video. But yeah, I was worried about this thing, about whether or not they were going to feel static, but from what I can tell, it doesn't seem that they have, as of yet, hit that point in which they're the characters in the game, so they can still have character development to become those characters, which is nice to know. A lot of them seem close, especially Jinx, but you can't see with characters like Victor that the complete transformation just hasn't happened yet. And that is a great choice. Stretch that character development a little bit more so that the story can be longer. Of course, that means that it's incomplete. And if the show were canceled, you'd have to say that the ending wasn't great. But it's a great cliffhanger, and at this point, we already got told on Saturday that we are going to get a season 2. So it's a great ending to season 1 and a great cliffhanger to keep us tuned in. But yeah, if this would have been the end, then it would have been like, whoa, you didn't finish anything. And that's fine, because they knew it was going to be the end. It was too good to fail, literally. With that being said, there was still a lot of payoff to be had in the final episode, even if it was mostly negative for our characters, to be honest. Negative in the sense of like negative character development, or I guess it's always subjective whether something is positive or negative, right? Because you can look at Jinx's character arc and say that it's positive for her and that she's now more empowered to be herself, or negative in the sense that she's let go of her familial ties, which was like the good thing in her life. So either way, you can whichever lens you choose to use, negative and positive character development are completely up to you to define, really. And that's what I want to talk about. The absolute best thing about this series so far have been the frankly Shakespearean-like character arcs. And I don't say Shakespearean as a hyperbole about the quality of the writing. Rather, I use it to describe the way the story writes its characters and makes their flaws be their undoing, at least so far. Let's begin with reiterating what we talked about in the last video. In last video, we talked about how Powder's need to feel useful was ultimately what killed her family. They were about to get away, but her innocent need to prove herself was her undoing. That is precisely how Shakespeare writes his tragic characters. They'll have some very human and perhaps not even entirely obvious flaw that is ultimately their own undoing and the source of greatest tragedy in their lives. And now that we know that that isn't what I mean by Shakespearean in the sense that their own flaws are what create their tragedy, we can go into Victor, for example, who had a very similar character arc. The same sort of thing happens here in Act 3. He's always had a good heart, and he genuinely wanted to help regular people, topside and underside, but because of his weak constitution, he feels that he may not be able to achieve this, or he feels that he may not be there to see it through or see it happen at all. In his desperation to try to see this, he will try anything on himself to extend his life or create something that can truly change the world. But he finds obstacles that can only be overcome with dangerous methods. Methods which he recognizes to be dangerous, but he's desperate enough that he has no trouble putting himself in danger. Experimenting on his own body, for example, but because he was too blind to see that others cared about him enough to risk their lives for him, he accidentally killed his assistant, Miss Young. Rest in peace. He said it later himself, in the pursuit of great, we failed to do good. Now this is also about Jason him, but it's his own feelings about what he did, for example. It's very natural to be desperate, but his folly was his undoing, just like with Powder. He thought that he'd kill himself because of the bad he had done, but luckily he was saved by Jace, who was also come to grow positively after becoming violent and raiding Silco's operation. We'll talk about that later too. But for Victor, that was enough to save him. Jace coming in, that is. for now at least. But that moment is actually something that I'd like to praise quite a bit. Of course, it mirrors the earlier moment in which Victor is the one who saves Jace as he's about to commit suicide by the same method, mind you. But there is another mirrored moment, or rather mirrored plot line, that I think was really, really effective in Act 3. And that is that just as Vander was faced with protecting the lanes and turning his family in, Silco was put in a similar situation where not only would his problems cease, but all his dreams for the nation of Zaun would come true. And all he had to do was hand Jinx over. I'll admit, whilst I was watching, I thought he'd do it. He was meant to be a villain, right, after all. But no, in his final moment, as he's dying, he affirms the truth that he would have never given them Jinx because she was his daughter and he loved her. In that moment, Silco gave her the single greatest words that Jinx could have possibly heard. You're perfect. Remember, it was Jinx's insecurity, her need to feel she was useful, that was her own undoing in Act 1 with the death of her first family. Her character need was to get validation from others, that not only was she useful, but that there was absolutely nothing wrong with her. That line, "You're perfect," fulfills Powder's character needs even in a twisted way, that it is finally makes her into something different, Jinx, but she no longer has this feeling about feeling incomplete or useless or like people don't value her after what Silco said to them. And that is a truly complete character arc, exemplified with her sitting in the Jinx seat and then obviously releasing the Rage of Zaun, which was carried by Silco into the giant missile that will no doubt kill most of the members of the council. Before I move on, I really do need to emphasize just how amazing I feel Silco was as a character. He had many challenges to overcome, but always did, and throughout he stayed true to himself, his dream, and most importantly, his daughter. It's sweetness from evil, which always makes these kind of characters sympathetic, even when they're not the greatest people. It's why I think a lot of people like characters like him and Loki. Often people will value loyalty over anything else, and loyalty coming from a villain is something that people, it seems so like contrary to their own nature that it almost makes that positive trait really, really stand out. And that's the case with Silco because he possesses loyalty in strides, even after having been betrayed by Vander. He doesn't want to have revenge on Vander, he just simply needs to take over his position so that he can have the power. Next, I want to talk about Vi. She didn't have that tragic moment that came from her folly. Well, she did, but it was in episode 1 when she went on that job that put the pieces into play for that day of tragedy in which Vander died. But since that day, she's done well and done her best ever since, sure, faltering a few times and feeling pain along the way, but her violent tendencies, which were her fatal flaw at the beginning, weren't really a factor in the tragedy that befell her in Acts 2 or 3. And so, while that first episode was a bit Shakespearean for her in her tragedy, in the tragedy that befell them in episode 3, really in Acts 2 and 3, her arc has been different. Rather, her arc is about maintaining the faith in her own strength despite all the shit life throws at her. And this will be challenged greatly at the point in which we left off, in which nothing she has done could possibly be to blame for the current circumstance, but she is still forced to be feeling pain from a world that can be very cruel by its own nature at times. Nothing is more venomous to a good heart than senseless tragedy. Whether or not she can get through it to become a stronger person is the challenge that she must face going forward. But remember, her struggle is no longer about, overcoming that flaw, because I believe she's hasn't done it perfectly, but she's overcome her violent flaw and understands that there are other ways to solve her problems without violence, and violence can often create more problems. But rather, her new arc is staying true to who she is and being good while the world challenges you to not be good. Then finally, we have Jace, whose main character theme has always been that of wielding power and how to use it. One way that the character arc in Act 3 was impressive and interesting is that the corruptive element in Act 2 was actually his good conscience in Act 3, and that is Mel. Without a doubt, it was Mel who began the corruption of Jace, but without the looming threat of violence, a new source of corruption comes to Jace in the form of Mrs. Medarda Sr., who foments Jace's urgency so that he may produce Hextech weapons. But Mel, who likes to be prepared but does not believe violence to be the first and right solution, is what reminds him that his initial beliefs of assuring peace were correct. Finally, after, that one moment of succumbing to his own power-hungry ways and violent a little bit, much like Vi, Jace comes up with a tough but realistic and peaceful solution, creating an ultimately good moment for him. But it will be immediately undercut by Jinx's missile, and I expect Jace will be blinded by revenge and fail to see the conclusion he came to at the end of Act 3 in the next season. He will keep struggling with how to wield power. That is his arc after all. The only one who really had any true completion could be said to be Jinx, but there is still much to see, especially with the probable reintroduction of Vander as Warwick. But yeah, those 4 tragic character arcs were what was really impressive about Arcane Season 1. It had 4 genuinely masterful character arcs that made all the characters feel amazing. It also cannot be overstated how good the side characters were for these stories. Vander, Mel, and Silco were also incredibly amazing characters in their own right, and in a lot of ways, it gave the writers more freedom to make characters that could overcome different changes because they're not champions. So of course they can die, as is probable for Mel and certain for Silco, and that's something that really helps with the main characters. Even smaller characters like Marcus and his predecessor Grayson were great additions to the story. Of course, they weren't main characters and they were just small pawns here and there, but they had a lot of heart in them and you could really understand their struggles. All the characters were great with positive qualities and flaws abound. To do it with so many characters is no easy feat and by far the most impressive thing about this show. And I want it to keep being the most impressive thing about this show. Character writing is the heart of a story, I think, often. Of course, you can say a lot about philosophy with world building, and that is also something that I find very interesting. But the heart of a story always comes down to character conflict. In fact, there's a very famous line. The only thing worth writing about is the human heart and in conflict with itself. Let's hope that my worries are founded about character arcs becoming more static and less interesting as the story develops, and that it keeps doing a good job with its characters. Perhaps we'll get to see that with a different cast of champions next season, but I still really want to know what happens to Vi, Caitlyn, and Jace especially, and Victor, of course. I mean, I kind of think we all see where Victor's arc is going, but the other 3 are very interesting. And I'm not a League super fan, so I don't really know exactly. I just know that Victor becomes a machine, so you tell me what's gonna happen, no? Yeah, I can't really speak to what I'd like to see, again, because I'm not well versed in the world, but I do know that I want to see more, and I'm really excited that we're gonna get a season 2, and I think that you should be too. I think, yeah, what I was gonna say about the characters are really the best part, but I can't overstate how good the production and the style of the show has been, as well as the world building that has gone into it. I know that's probably more praise for the lore team behind League of Legends than it is for perhaps the story makers, but it's always good to understand the world and extrapolate it. That's also a very valuable skill to have as a writer. And yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I think that's it for Arcane content for a while. Of course, I'll definitely talk about it when it comes back. But sadly, it was just, the first video and the second video, so. Well, I'll see you in the next video, I guess. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. See you.